morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I was tasked providing you a summary of IND safety reporting, which I will do from the clinical perspective. I'm medical team leader, Division of Anti-Infectives Products at CDER, and we as medical officers are the primary recipients of your safety reports for the IND. So we would be looking at the safety reports that are well written and to the point. So with that, by the way of introduction, I want to tell you that final safety reporting rule came to be because we were inundated with safety reports. And you know, when the flow is very high, it's very difficult to pick that grain that the safety issues that will cause us to investigate the safety profile of the drug further, and whether to stop the investigation or allow it to proceed with certain safety constraints. I will provide you an overview of sources of safety information during different stages of IND development. We'll talk about the safety monitoring and adverse event ascertainment during the clinical development. We'll go through the thought process that goes into safety reporting. We'll touch base on the safety assessment committees, and I'll provide you a summary and references for all of the above. So evaluation of safety is an evolving process, and the available information depends on the stage of product development. Safety for approved drugs is available in the package insert, or also known as the product labeling. For the drugs that are in development, the most up-to-date safety information is contained in investigator's brochure. And that covers non-clinical information, the clinical pharmacology information, and safety information from the clinical trials. For the products under investigation, investigator brochure is equivalent to package insert. With regard to the sources of safety information, well, the most pertinent one will be clinical data that is collected in the population, the indication is being studied, because it just gives you a level playing field of the risk factors as well as the underlying medical conditions, concomitant medications in that patient population. However, when you just initiating first-in-human clinical studies, the only information that might be available is chemistry information and the non-clinical information, which is in vitro data and data from animal studies. Clinical pharmacology studies will provide you with the safety information in healthy volunteers. And also the clinical trial safety data for other indications is of importance because it sort of broadens your patient population and you get safety signals from different varieties of patients. Post-marketing experience is also very important when the drug comes onto the market. Now, vast majority of populations being exposed is much larger than your typical clinical trial patient population. And of course, medical literature, epidemiological studies that analyze in a certain manner, such as meta-analyses, will be able to come up with safety targets. Also, safety profile of the drugs in the same class will give you sort of an anticipated safety profile for your drug under study. So with regard to the non-clinical information, we use the understanding of the chemical structure of the drug as well as the drug class that this particular product that under investigation belongs to better understand what adverse event profile the drug might exhibit in the clinical studies. In vitro toxicity evaluation includes genotoxicity, cardiac repolarization studies, and pharmacology toxicology studies in animals will provide you so understanding which particular organs might need to be closer monitored during the clinical development. In addition, carcinogenicity and intergenicity potential is evaluated in non-clinical studies in animals. With regards to the clinical studies and clinical trials, Again, as I mentioned before, the data from healthy volunteers generally collected in your phase 1 studies, and this is the cleanest data you can possibly have because but the subjects are healthy. There's no underlying medical conditions that might interfere with the safety profile of the drug, and there's no concomitant medications. However, and also, the study drug safety profile is compared to placebo in most cases. So, however, the studies are fairly small, so the exposure is limited, and therefore the signals might not be, readily available in this type of studies. The next patient populations is your patients, the patients with the condition under study. That again gives you a safety profile of the drug, how it interacts with the disease itself, with the concomitant medication the patient might be on. Is there any drug-drug interactions, or whether underlying conditions of the patients, the other additional risk factors that might play a role on how the drug manifests itself. In addition, the special populations of patients with renal and hepatic impairment, extremes of age, and pregnant lactating women might represent a very different patient population, and the drug safety profile might be very different from a general patient population. So what do we do in terms of safety monitoring? We collect data for adverse events. And those could be coming from a variety of sources. It could be abnormal vital signs, unusual presentation of the disease, new diseases, EKG abnormalities, laboratory abnormalities, constellations of signs and symptoms, as well as the imaging abnormalities. And to summarize it on the slide, this is a regulatory definition of adverse event. So it's any untoward medical occurrence with the use of drug in humans, where they're not considered drug-related. And as presented on the diagram on the slide before, it could be sign or symptom or a disease, abnormal laboratory imaging findings, abnormalities of EKG, worsening of the above, or constellation of the above. Ascertainment of adverse events during clinical studies, clinical trials, take several forms. It could be spontaneous reporting by the patient, the subject on the study, or it could be observed by the investigator during the study visit. In addition, these symptoms and signs could be elicited as a result of the probe. It's a checklist or a questionnaire. In addition, the testing that's employed in the protocol, whether it's vital sign measurements, laboratory testing, specialty assessments such as hearing or vision screening, imaging, could be eliciting adverse events as well. Once adverse event is reported, we expect it to be graded on severity. And for that, it could range from mild to severe to life-threatening. For that, we employ the adverse event severity grading tables, and they provide the general guidance on the parameters for monitoring safety in clinical trials. But they are very specific to the patient population. Obviously, if you have a healthy volunteer who don't have any underlying disease, the cutoffs for different grades of the severity would be different from the patient who is enrolled in oncology trial, so a patient who has underlying malignancy, for example. It also depends on the phase of product development and on the product being evaluated, whether it's a small molecule or it's a biologic device or vaccine. Examples of the grade toxicity tables are provided here, and I'll provide you a link at the reference slide at the end of my presentation. So for safety reporting purposes, there are a few definitions that you need to be familiar with, and we'll go over them in sequence. The first one is serious adverse events. And the regulation is defined, the serious adverse event is defined as any adverse event that, in the opinion of investigator or sponsor, result in death or is life-threatening, result in hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, result in disability, or congenital anomaly or birth defect. In addition, it could be a medically important event that will result in any of the four of the above without an appropriate intervention, such as surgery or the acute medical intervention. On this slide, you can see a list of uncommon serious adverse events that should raise a flag of it being related to the drug exposure, because they are generally uncommon in general patient population. And we'll have reference to this slide later on when we're going to go over the cases presented. So how do we evaluate a serious adverse event? Dr. Charu Malik has mentioned some of the steps in her presentation. We need to know how common these adverse events in the population under study. Obviously, you can have healthy volunteers, but you have patients who have underlying conditions, and the disease under study can potentially cause some of the adverse events that had been listed as uncommon serious adverse events on the slide before. Has this adverse event is treatment is it treatment emergent? Means does it occur? Did it occur when the patient was taking the drug, or shortly after the drug had been discontinued? Also, whether the adverse event had responded to the challenge, to drug discontinuation or reduction of the dose. Did it recur on rechallenge? When the drug was reduced, did the adverse event reappear? Were there any concomitant medications, the safety profile of which might point out that they might have been the cause of this event? And were there any pertinent laboratory or other testing done to try to elucidate any potential alternative causes for this event occurrence? So that's what it is. Was there an obvious and alternative cause for this event? And whether this serious adverse event is a study endpoint. So why is it important to go through all these questions? Well, it fits into the adverse event reporting requirements for the clinical investigators to the sponsor. So all serious adverse events, regardless of causality, need to be reported to the sponsor. And in addition, adverse events and laboratory abnormalities are very crucial to safety assessments within the study protocol. Also, the study endpoints that a serious adverse event should be reported to the sponsor, but only if there's a suspicion that drug had caused the event. Investigators, when they send the report of serious adverse event to the sponsor, need to provide the causality assessment. So to go through the list of questions, that I had presented on the previous slide, to for the sponsor to understand, what could be potential relationship between the drug and the serious adverse event being reported. So let's illustrate it by case number 1. You are a sponsor of an ongoing study evaluating an antihypertensive drug A for whether it's associated with reduced risk of death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. So your primary endpoint is a composite of death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And now you're getting a report that the 75-year-old white male had died on your study. So does the investigator have to report this case to the sponsor? What are your thoughts? Yes, you would think it should be, but let's go step by step. So yes, the patient had died. It means that it is a serious adverse event, right? However, as you can read on the slide, it's a part of the endpoint in the study. So the investigator reports only certain serious adverse events that are a part of the endpoints on the study. So let's say we need to know some more information. What caused death in this particular patient? Let's say the patient had died of anaphylaxis. Do we report it to the sponsor? And the answer is yes, we do report it to the sponsor because the cause of death was anaphylaxis. It's one of those serious uncommon adverse events that do not happen in general patient population. So there's a reasonable causality here that the drug probably caused anaphylaxis and resulted in patient death. Therefore, even though this serious adverse event is part of the endpoint on the study, this adverse event had to be reported to the sponsor. So once a serious adverse event is reported to the sponsor, or any adverse event for that matter is reported to the sponsor, it undergoes a process of conversion of the verbatim terms, what investigator had wrote on the case report forms, that they considered the adverse event, into a standardized format, a standardized preferred term that will allow you, the sponsor, or us as regulators to group the like events together and ascertain what is the incidence of the adverse events on the study. So we can determine whether the rate of the adverse events on the study drug is different from that of the placebo or an active comparator. So currently most commonly used dictionary is MEDR dictionary. It's medical dictionary for regulatory activities. With coding comes a number of problems. Because the way the dictionary is structured, there is a possibility of splitting preferred terms into different categories. Like, for example, the same adverse event of increased blood pressure could be coded as hypertension or increased blood pressure. It will go to different parts of the dictionary, different hierarchical places. So when you're just searching for the incidence of the adverse event of hypertension, it gives you one number. For the high blood pressure, it gives you another number. So we need to make sure that these two are combined. Another coding problem might be lumping of the different preferred terms into a single one. For example, edema. Leg edema has one etiology versus facial edema. You know, these have a very different background, very different pathogenesis. Lumping them together can obscure a certain safety signal. In addition, there might be lack of adequate term definitions, particularly for syndromic adverse events such as drug hypersensitivity, metabolic syndrome, or serotonin syndrome. And those, if they are expected in your clinical trial with your particular study drug, we like you to define those a priori within the study protocol so investigator knows how to report them appropriately, and then the coding team will know how to code them under the dictionary term. So the second important definition for the safety reporting is unexpected adverse event. So what is unexpected adverse event? It is not listed in the investigator's brochure. Our investigator's brochure has not been required. You know, the drug is approved and you're using package insert instead of your investigator's brochure. It's not listed in the specificity or severity observed. Let's say we had adverse event of hearing loss. So it's listed in the investigator's brochure as mild hearing loss. Now you are observing a complete deafness, a very severe adverse event. So it reported in the investigator's brochure as mild. Now you're seeing a severe, then it's an unexpected adverse event. So, or the adverse event had been mentioned in investigators' brochures occurring with drugs of the same class. So you anticipated potentially to see this adverse events in your clinical trial, but to date it had not been observed. These adverse events would be considered unexpected. Let's illustrate this in case number 2. You are a sponsor for the trial evaluating a new quinolone antibacterial drug B for the treatment of pneumonia. Your investigator brochure lists number of serious adverse events associated with the quinolone class of drugs, including neurotoxicity and specifically seizures. Seizures would be considered serious adverse events, and it's neurotoxic adverse events. So this is adverse event that you now observe in your trial, a seizure. Will we consider this adverse event expected or unexpected? Audience? Unexpected, because it's listed in investigator's brochure as occurring with the same class of drugs, but to date it had not been observed with your particular quinolone antibacterial. So therefore, for the reporting purposes, it would be considered unexpected adverse event. And the last and very important definition that you need to go through is suspected adverse reaction. For the reporting purposes, it's very important. So again, there's some reasonable possibility of adverse event being caused by a drug. That's what suspected adverse reaction is. It could be a single occurrence of an uncommon event that's known to be associated with drug exposure, like the list of the serious adverse event that I presented on a few slides before, such as anaphylaxis or Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It could be an event that is not commonly associated with drug exposure. However, it's very uncommon in the patient population under study, such as neutropenia in healthy volunteers. Or the aggregate analysis of the safety data collected to date, whether from your study or from the studies, other studies conducted under your IND, you see that the rates of this particular events are higher with your product relative to the comparator or placebo or historic control. In this diagram, I'd like to illustrate that the important adverse reactions occur in very small proportion of the universe of the adverse events. I mean, we would like to target adverse reactions as a reporting for the INDs. However, in real life scenario, it's very difficult with 100% certainty to say, well, this event for sure, 100% had been associated with this drug. But we trying to aim for reporting purposes look into suspected adverse reactions, though that there's a reasonable possibility of drug-related causality. So that's what we want you to report. So with regards to the expedited safety reporting to the FDA by the sponsor, we're going to be reporting adverse events that meet all three criteria, which are adverse events should be serious. S stands for serious. Unexpected, U for unexpected, and suspected adverse reactions, SAR. SAR, you need to know this acronym. Serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reactions. The fatal and life-threatening SARs need to be reported to the FDA within 7 days of you becoming aware of this reaction. And for all others, it would be 15 days cutoff. We'll illustrate that in case number 3. So in a study of a marketed HIV drug C, an 8-month-old infant enrolled at 1 month of age was noted at month 4 to develop mild hearing loss in progress notes. Should this event be reported to the sponsor, by investigator, to the sponsor expeditiously? Yes or no? Yes, that is correct, because hearing loss is serious adverse events. It's a disability. It's an adverse event that results in disability. So the investigator has to report serious adverse events regardless of causality to the sponsor, but needs to assess causality. In this particular case, the investigator thought the adverse event was not related to the study drug because the baby had congenital syphilis. So it has a very clear alternative explanation for the hearing loss. So that information was provided to the sponsor. The sponsor investigated these adverse events further. So first of all, the drugs are approved in adults. And they looked at the package insert, and there's nowhere that ototoxicity or hearing loss had been mentioned in adult clinical trials. So by definition, this makes this adverse event as unexpected, right? So we have serious and unexpected. Next thing, okay, well, even though there was an alternative explanation for the event by the investigator, at the next meeting of the Safety Assessment Committee, the safety data collected to date had been analyzed, and it was determined that there were 3 cases of hearing loss on study drug C versus only a single case on the comparator arm. So therefore, this makes a definition of of the suspected adverse reaction. Suspected adverse reaction where in aggregate analysis, the rate of the adverse event is higher on your drug relative to comparator. So that means that there's a reasonable possibility of causality. So therefore, this particular event of moderate hearing loss is serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reaction. And is this event reportable to FDA? Show of hands? That's right. You got it. You got it. So the sponsor reports not only individual cases of serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reaction, but also has responsibility to report findings from other studies either conducted by the IND or studies conducted outside the IND, the safety findings from the medical literature, epidemiology studies, and so on. Findings from new findings from animal and in vitro studies that raise the risk to human subjects, and also increased rate of the occurrence of serious suspected adverse reactions. These reports are made to the FDA no later than 15 days after you becoming aware of the safety finding. So, as I had mentioned before, certain adverse events that are very common in the patient population under study will be difficult to assess for. It's important then to provide and conduct aggregate analysis of the safety data within this particular study, but also within the IND, many studies that might have been conducted under the IND with this drug. And the comparator could be a placebo or active comparator, but in addition, it could be in dose-ranging studies that lower dose relative to what you're going to be assessing safety. So now we'll switch a little bit gears, who might be helpful for you to ascertain whether the adverse events are serious and suspected adverse reactions, and analyze the data from the ongoing clinical trials. Well, it would be a safety assessment committee. It's a group of clinical trial experts that will assess whether adverse events in an ongoing trial need to be reported to FDA in real time, take into account all the safety data for the whole IND. It follows a predefined safety surveillance plan, which identifies anticipated serious adverse events in your patient population and provide the predicted rates at which these events generally occur in that patient population. It also lists the previously reported suspected adverse reactions and the rate at which that had been reported, because any increase in the rate of suspected adverse reaction on your trials is also reportable to the FDA. It identifies the role for its members, specifies the frequency of the regular meetings and ad hoc procedures, outlines the principles for unblinded review of safety data, and is available for FDA assessment. So how do safety assessment committees assess adverse events? Well, they have ability to unblind the data for a specific case to identify, well, whether the study drug, the patient was on the study drug or the comparator of the placebo. So obviously, if it is on comparator of the placebo, you are not required to report that event to the FDA. Whether the event needs to be reported based on aggregate analysis, so they do provide unblinded analysis of safety data from ongoing trial, but also all the trials conducted under your IND. And whether they also provide the guidance to the sponsor whether the study needs to be modified. Some inclusion-exclusion criteria might need to be modified based on the safety data collected, or informed consent as well, or even safety monitoring procedures to identify certain event in due time to keep them progressing to this serious condition. So after the drug had been approved, that doesn't necessarily, stops the drug development, right? You will continue possibly developing drug for other indications. There might be post-marketing safety trials need to be required, and these trials are also subject to FDA IND safety reporting. There's also NDA safety reporting. We expect that for the drug that are approved, periodically report safety data for the use of the drug in clinical trials, as well as in patients that had been approved for their, it's periodically reported and annually reported. So in summary, I would like to conclude that the evaluation of safety spans the drug lifetime, the whole life cycle, from the time it first makes it into the human and after the drug had been approved. The investigators, clinical investigators, play a very crucial role in providing all important information on the safety reports to the FDA and to the sponsor for them and for us to make appropriate decision on the risk this particular event might be posing to the patients enrolling on the study. And the sponsor, with the help of Safety Assessment Committee, will be able to report to us serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reactions, and any increase in suspected adverse reaction rates, as well as increased adverse event rate that potentially might pose risk the patients and the study subjects, and any new safety findings from non-clinical trials. And here, the list of reference here, you will see that we have links to final safety reporting rule, as well as the guidances that provide you with additional details and examples to do your safety reporting appropriately. There also are a number of links to the toxicity grading tables, as well as MedWatch reporting. Any questions?
They're coming down in droves here.
I have one question. So you mentioned if it's a safety event from a placebo, sponsor is not required to report that?
No, you do not report, obviously, serious adverse events happening on placebo.
So what if it's a comparator which is already approved, but you see a SUSAR?
The same thing. You are responsible for reporting only adverse events associated with your drug.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Can you please clarify for me which safety events of those 4 categories you provided require 7-day reporting and which ones require 15-day reporting?
So for the categories, you mean for the serious adverse events? Right. So only the ones that are life-threatening or fatal. So that will require 7-day reporting. Everything else will be 15.
So for example, if there was a death in a trial, but that death was due to maybe a car accident completely unrelated to the trial, is that reportable?
Well, it should be a reasonable possibility of causality there. Well, it could be tricky for the car accident. If the patient was driving, potentially, if you know that the drug may have sedative effects or cloud some consciousness in this particular patient, yes, that might be a reasonable possibility that drug caused certain events in the patient that resulted in the car accident. However, the patient was a passenger in the car, and it was a car accident. It's unlikely that this was caused by a drug. So it depends how far you can investigate it further, and what do you know already about the drug safety profile from non-clinical studies, from your first-in-human trials, and so on.
So what I'm hearing is reporting is required when you can establish causality.
Correct.
Or possible causality. Yeah. Okay.
Let's take an online question, and we'll come back here in the room.
We had a few online questions that referred to the challenge of reviewing all of the safety reports that are submitted regarding their drug. If there's any sort of guidance that you could provide on that challenge.
Sorry?
Can you repeat the question, please, Ray?
We had a few questions come in. They were very complex. Each one was about a page long. And it involved the challenge of reviewing all the safety reports that regarding particular drugs that they're overseeing and the challenges associated with that. Can you provide any guidance on meeting the challenge of reviewing all of those safety reports that come in?
Well, all the safety reports. You mean for the FDA, for the sponsor? Sorry, I'm a bit confused.
And because we've got a lot of people here in the room, I'm actually we're gonna hold that one for a little later.
Right.
Thank you, Ray. Microphone number 2, please.
Right. So we have some investigator-sponsored trials, or a cooperative group who holds their own IND, and they're cross-referencing our IND. My understanding is that we, as the sponsor, need to establish an agreement with that investigator to obtain any serious adverse events. We also have an obligation to report those if we determine that they're causally related, even if the investigator may say it's not causally related. Is that
Right, correct. The buck stops with the sponsor. So
Yeah.
yes, investigator does provide their own assessment of causality, right? So
Right.
they might determine the event is not related. However, you have a better understanding of the safety profile of the drug because you do provide the assessment on all the trials. You have a bird's eye view of what's
Exactly.
going on with the drug. So you might have a better understanding and whether this event might be related. So you do make your own assessment of causality.
And despite the fact, if we both determine that it meets the SUSAR reporting criteria, we submit to R&D, and they need to submit to their IND as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's difficult to get them to understand that while duplicative, this is what is required. Is there ever a case where the investigator does not have to submit to their IND? Can they transfer obligations?
As the innovator, you have to follow the AEs for your ingredient or your product through the life cycle. Once it hits a mature level and there's generics available, if there's updates in your labeling that you report to the FDA, what is your responsibility or requirements to notify the ANDA holders?
So you generally do not notify ANDA holders. So what's happening, it depends also whether the drug is still under investigation. So right, for the drugs that are still under investigation, you obviously report to your IND and you report to the clinical investigators that are enrolling the patient in the particular trials that are still active under the IND. But you do not notify the ANDA sponsors. You have the obligation to report it to the FDA, and we, in conjunction with you, will look, towards to possibly updating the package insert, the product labeling, and then the ANDA sponsors will take that updated safety labeling and apply it to their particular products that they market.